Well, hello and welcome to episode 84 of the Learn and Work Smarter podcast. I'm Katie, and today we're talking about something that we have all experienced, and that is failure. This episode was actually inspired by a question I got during a Q&A inside SchoolHabits University. Inside my course, I offer Q&As for students for a year, and a student asked me, this was an awesome question, how do you deal with failure? Like they were specifically asking me, not like the general you, but like, Katie, how do you specifically deal with failure? And to be honest, I paused. I did not have a quick answer. Now, the question stumped me, not because I haven't failed. I most definitely have failed. And I'm going to share some of those experiences with you throughout the course of this episode, but I think it's because I have trained myself so well, for better or for worse, to reframe setbacks that I rarely experience them as failures anymore. I am a wildly competitive person, and failure naturally does not feel good to me at all, as I'm sure all of you listening will agree. And so maybe it's just the very strong discomfort I feel when I sit with the idea of failure that has ignited that mindset shift I use today to just reframe everything that's a failure as like a learning experience. But who knows? But now I can look at what worked, what didn't work, and what I need to change next time so that I don't make that same mistake again. That is my instinct now. But it most definitely was not always that way. So in this episode, I'm going to walk you through how I personally think about failure, how I teach it to my students in ways that they can move forward from that experience, and how to recognize the difference between real, genuine failure that's trying to tell you something, and then also what is just a misstep, which is also trying to tell us something. You're going to walk away from this episode with actionable strategies, as well as some perspective tweaks that can improve your recovery from whatever it is that you're going through that feels like failure. Now, there's an expression that I like to use a lot when I'm coaching my students, but also when I'm coaching myself, and that is that beginnings hide themselves in ends. I didn't make that up. I heard it years ago, but I love it. Beginnings hide themselves in ends. And I think that that kind of thinking is at the core of what we're going to be talking about today. So if you're a student who has failed in some way at school, either literally failed tests, or you're looking back at your academic journey and you're just not where you'd thought you'd be, and you're viewing that as a failure, or perhaps you're feeling like a failure by someone else's terms, then this episode is for you. If you're a working professional and you've either failed at a work project or you don't take the risks that you know you should be taking because you're so afraid of failure and what that might mean, I'm air quoting it if you don't see this on YouTube. Or maybe you too are looking back at your career history and you're not where you thought you'd be and you are viewing yourself as a failure, then this episode is for you. We are all exactly where we're supposed to be, but sometimes the journey looks different than we had planned. So stick around, and I think that you're going to get something useful from our episode today. And as you know by now, you can find all the links to everything I mentioned in the show notes at learnandworksmarter.com/podcast/84, because this is episode 84. All right, let's begin. Hello, you are listening to the Learn and Work Smarter podcast, the podcast for students and professionals who want to learn and work smarter. I'm your host, executive function coach, and founder of SchoolHabits.com, Katie Azevedo. As a reminder, everything I mention in today's episode will be linked in the show notes, including a link to the transcript, which you can also find at learnandworksmarter.com/podcast. So I want to start by talking about the definition of failure and how each of us personally defines failure can have a significant impact on whether we can learn from that failure or not. Now, most people define failure in black and white terms, like I failed the test, my project didn't work, the launch flopped, but that binary lens isn't helpful. It's also not accurate. Think about it. Failure is often a label that we apply after something doesn't meet our expectations. Yes, even if you literally failed an exam because you didn't get a passing grade of, let's say, 65, yes, technically you failed the exam, but it's not the number that's going to do you in. It's the meaning that we assign to it and the idea that we feel crushed because we didn't meet the expectation we had for ourselves, or maybe that our professor had for us. That's what does us in. When we categorically define something as a failure, Instead of something that we can learn from or pivot from, we immediately shut down any possibility of a rebound, a comeback, or even an alternative solution. Whether it truly is a sort of grade threshold kind of failure, or maybe just a sales pitch that didn't go over well, labeling something as a failure can be paralyzing. Or what I'm hoping to teach you today, it can be a pivot point. Now, at the risk of sounding a little woo-woo, I'm going to emphatically make the point here that most failures are actually situations that we just haven't fully understood or taken advantage of yet. And I know that if anyone listening right now is in the midst of a failure at school or at work, hearing that might make you roll your eyes. I know that there have been plenty of times in my life when I've been in the middle of something that I was catastrophically defining as a failure. And if someone came up to me and said, hey, Katie, like beginnings hide themselves in ends, I would have come back with every yeah, but in the book. So if that's what you're feeling right now, totally fine. I just want you to sit with that feeling and hear me out. You know, it's often when we pause that we're able to see a different perspective of the situation. And that's also when we're able to redefine those failures as non-binary, or maybe even not as failures at all. Let me give you an example. One of the clearest times that I felt the emotional weight of a failure, despite actually doing nothing wrong, was when I was in college. When I submitted a Spanish paper that I was really, really proud of. I double majored in college, Spanish and English, and so to be frank, I took school really, really seriously, which can't be a surprise to any of you. And one of my personal goals during college was to become fluent in Spanish. And we had this one paper. Now, I want to remind you that this is back in 2002 or 2003 when there was no Google Translate. There was no, Chat GPT or anything of the sort. So if there was something that I didn't know about a particular Spanish tense, I had to consult my favorite Spanish grammar book, which I still have, and look up the conjugations. Also, this paper was to analyze a piece of Spanish literature, and keep in mind that I was also an English major, so analyzing literature was something that I literally did in my sleep. So take this combination of knowing very well how to analyze literature and working super, super hard on getting my Spanish grammar right, and what happens? I'm accused of cheating. My professor did not believe that I could have written something that good on my own because I was not a native Spanish speaker like the majority of people in my course. I was devastated. I had never in my life been accused of anything like that. Of course I didn't cheat, okay? But I hadn't even gotten help. He was like, at the end, he was like, well, maybe you even went to the writing center. I'm like, check the logs. I could run the writing center, professor. But anyway, his reaction and his accusation made me question myself. And for a moment, I thought, like, did I accidentally do something wrong? Like, just by doing well? What about my reputation? Is he going to think badly of me? Is he, even though I was able to 100% prove the work was mine by recreating that same level of excellence for every single paper for the rest of the semester? Obviously, he came around and with his tail between his legs. But that moment wasn't a failure, but it felt like one to me. And it taught me that sometimes we internalize failure because someone else can't see our progress for what it really is. Now, another example I can share is a story from when I taught high school. I was a special education teacher, and I had a student on my caseload with a diagnosed specific learning disability. That's what it's called, specific learning disability. And hers was in math. And despite, modifications to the curriculum and assessments, poor girl, she just couldn't. And after about a semester of trying, every new approach with her, she was able to get her math grade up out of the failing zone by 1 point for the first time all year. She worked so darn hard for that 66 average, and I was so excited to share her victory with her parents at parent-teacher conferences. But lo and behold, her dad was so disappointed in his daughter, and he made sure we all knew it. He couldn't see that 66 was actually incredible, and it represented all of the hard work that his daughter had put into that class and into herself. All he could see was the failure. That poor student. So the takeaway from these stories is that it is important to examine the situation we're in and ask ourselves, is this a true failure based on my own expectations or based on someone else's? Because the answer to that question matters a lot because it dictates the next step. So speaking of the next step, it's time we actually talk about what that might be. Of course, sometimes we do fail by the classic definition of the word, but that is not the end of the road. There is an expression we can use here, which is failing forward. And as cheesy as you think that might be, it is the mindset that we need to take if we are ever going to turn our failures into something. Now, failing forward doesn't mean brushing off setbacks. It's not toxic positivity. It means mining our failures for what they're trying to teach us and then adjusting accordingly. So, how do we fail forward? By staying curious, by asking ourselves, what happened here? What can I tweak? Where did I go off the rails? And we don't ask ourselves these questions from a place of angst or shame, but from a place of genuine curiosity. Like, what went wrong? What did I think was going well that actually was going the wrong direction? It was the wrong strategy. Is this situation repairable if I go back and try to fix it? Or should I just, let it go and go in a whole new direction? If we don't ask ourselves these questions when we've failed at something, we won't be able to see all the solutions and alternatives that are available to us. That, and of course, then we risk making the same mistakes over and over because we never did the autopsy on our mistakes in the first place. Now, I'm going to share another personal example where I experienced a failure by my own terms. I don't see it that way now, but at the time I was definitely bummed. After 2 very successful live launches of SchoolHabits University, I was, eager and excited to go to an evergreen model. Live launching is when, I say, okay, the cart is open, you can get in for these 10 days, and evergreen is you can enroll at any point. All right, live launching was very effective, but it drained me. And I have a delicate nervous system. So that I knew that that was not a sustainable approach. So I set up a page on my website at SchoolHabitsUniversity.com, and I added a button that said enroll now. And I thought that was it. But sales dropped significantly. Now, I could have quit right there. I could have taken the course down. I never would have, obviously. Or I could have just settled for the low enrollment that was trickling in. And if I didn't know how to examine and reframe my failures, then I would have done just that. But instead, I brought my setup to a business coach who told me point blank, this is not going to work. You cannot set it and forget it. And that hurt. But she was so right, and hurt my ego. I was like, what do you mean? But she was so right. So I just completely reworked everything. I actually bought a course about a real, what's called evergreen strategy. I built a proper sales system. It's, in marketing and sales, it's called a funnel. I built that and I rebuilt the experience from the ground up. If you get any emails from me, you're in my funnel. Now, the system currently works beautifully. Students are finding the course and they're getting the results that they deserve to have because I didn't give up when the first version failed. So when things go wrong, it's not about being resilient in the fluffy woo-woo sense. It's about decoding what happened and then adjusting course from there. So let's dig in a little bit deeper here. What are some practical strategies that we can use in the immediate moments after a failure? Well, in the first few minutes or even hours, or, for some of us days after we failed something, we may feel a lot of things. And it's best to give ourselves some time to sit with those feelings until they soften a bit. Otherwise, we'll be operating from a place of defense and shame instead of from a place of curiosity and self-awareness. So after your feelings have softened, here are some ideas with examples to illustrate their application. Strategy number 1. We already talked a little bit about this, but you got to do a quick post-mortem. What was the goal? What actually happened? What can be repeated or retired? So for example, let's say that you had a sales goal of $20,000 for the month, but you came in short at $15,000. What actually happened? Did you make fewer phone calls? Was your lead generation game off? Were there factors beyond your control? If so, letting the situation go is probably a good option there if it's nothing you can control. If you're a student and you studied all night for an exam that didn't go well, what happened? If you don't examine your efforts that went into the failure, in fact, even leading up to the failure, how would you ever see the reality that studying for an exam the night before does not ever work on a neurological level? We can't go from short-term memorization to long-term knowledge acquisition overnight just because we want to, just because we have poor time management. Okay? But now that you've identified that your cram session is the reason for your bad test grade, now you know to do something different next time. But imagine if you didn't pause to examine the situation and you got the bad grade and you thought like the test was super hard and I didn't do anything wrong and the professor's unfair. Well, then you'd make the same mistake next time and you'd be in the exact same situation over and over and over again. That's failing backward, not forward. We've got to look at our failures and say what worked, what didn't, what should I do again, and what should I not do again. All right? Strategy number 2, turn lessons into systems. Now, this doesn't work for every single failure. It depends on what type of thing you failed at, but let's just go with me here. Turning lessons into systems. These could be SOPs, workflows, templates, even routines. So, for example, let's say that you make a slide presentation at work and you got really strong feedback on it that you're taking as criticism, as a failure. Okay, well, can you take that feedback and use it to make a slide template to use in your next presentation? Like up the ante on that slide template. If you did poorly on that test that you crammed for the night before, can you create a new study routine based on cognitive science that uses spaced repetition and active recall study strategies? If you regularly struggle with certain tasks at the office, can you make yourself some SOPs, some standard operating procedures, so you stop guessing and failing? I teach all about SOPs in episode 52. But the key idea here is to take the lesson that you learned from the failure and, if it's possible, to turn it into a system or something that you can routinize. All right? And then strategy number 3, ask for help. If you can't figure out the reason for your failure by yourself, and it's not a situation where you were, given direct feedback, then ask. Ask someone who knows you and is familiar with the projects that you failed at to share their insights into what maybe went wrong. There's an expression that says we can't read the label if we're inside the bottle, right? So it can be helpful to ask someone standing on the outside of the bottle to read the label for us, right? I do teach you concrete strategies for asking for help in episode 39. And then in episode 37, I do a deep dive into how to accept feedback without getting defensive. Those links will be in the show notes at learnandworksmarter.com/podcast/84. All right, finally, strategy number 4 is to figure out the next step. Because if you think about it, after we fail at something, we do have a few choices, depending on the situation. It's when we catastrophize and think that there are no solutions because everything is falling apart, that we really are unable to come up with any solutions at all. Our brains are unable to problem solve and see that, yes, there are levers within our reach that we can pull to change the situation. Okay, so here are our options. We can literally just try again. Sometimes we have the right strategy and the right approach, but we just need more reps, so to speak. So maybe your next step is just to get back on the field and play again. Let's say that you've never played the piano in your life. Well, of course you're going to fail if you were asked to perform. But in that case, it's to be expected because you haven't done enough reps. Now, another option is to completely pivot. So go in a new direction. Scratch what you were doing before and do something totally new. If you tried out for the soccer team and didn't make it, okay, cool. Well, would now be a good time to try tennis? If you failed at staying on top of your running routine, would maybe it be better if you switched to walking? If you failed to be consistent using your fancy pants task management system, project management software, would it be better to switch to something simpler like a paper planner? This isn't quitting. This isn't giving up. It's an intentional change of course that might take you to your destination faster. Or the third option is just to tweak what you were doing. Maybe you don't need to throw in the towel and pivot entirely. Maybe it's not a matter of getting in more reps of the same strategy. Maybe the solution is to look at what you did and just make one small tweak at a time until it works. But I'll tell you what's not a strategy: doing nothing. The story I shared about the first time I turned SchoolHabits University into an evergreen course and then realizing that that wasn't working and then pivoting my marketing strategy to something different, that's an example of doing a post-mortem, of asking for feedback. and then implementing that feedback in the form of a tweak or a pivot. And now I can honestly look back at that situation and not view it as a failure at all. Because now I'm like, oh, that's so cool that that happened, because now look at all the cool marketing tech things that I know, right? That's what I was talking about at the top of this episode when I told you that I really do have trouble viewing anything as a true failure, because something really cool, really neat, always comes from it if you let it. Now, I've shared a lot of stories and strategies that almost make it seem like nothing is a failure if you just think about it differently. But that's not exactly true. And that's not my message here. I think that's unrealistic. Sometimes we really do need to use the word failure, but only when we're ready to extract the value from that situation. It is okay to use the word failure as a neutral term to describe a pattern or a moment, but not as a judgment of ourselves. It can be helpful to say that failed, but only if we followed up with now what, right? So I just want to clarify that I'm not suggesting that we, sugarcoat everything that is truly a personal, academic, or career setback and pretend that it didn't happen. That approach doesn't serve us either. Years ago, I was the vice president of a test prep company. I started building my own thing on the side, not in competition at all. School Habits was just something that I believed in at my core. But one day, I was let go. Abruptly. No warning. No severance. And while I cannot share the details, I'll just say that I was devastated. It felt like the floor dropped out from underneath me. The floor that I built. But looking back, that moment was the beginning of School Habits. That painful experience gave me the clarity, the freedom, and frankly, the freaking fire to go all in. I hit that ground running so fast and so hard, and I have never once looked back. I thank my blessings for that day. At the time, it looked and it felt like a failure, but it was actually the start of everything amazing that came next. All right, let's do a soft recap of what we have covered today. Failure is rarely ever what it seems. It's often a signal. Sometimes it's just a misunderstanding. Other times it is a lesson wrapped in frustration, which we have to let kind of cool, but it is never the end of your story ever, ever. We almost always have the option to try again, to get in more reps, so to speak, or maybe just tweak our approach a little bit, or even start from scratch and go in a completely different direction. But these are all options available to us only if we take the time after a failure to examine what happened after our emotions have cooled. So if there is something in your life or work or school that you have been calling a failure, pause and ask, what actually happened? What have I learned? And what do I want to do next? All right, my friends, I hope this episode provided some new ways of thinking. Maybe some of the examples I shared resonated. If you have enjoyed this episode, please make sure you let me know through a simple gesture like liking the video that you're watching on YouTube or sharing the episode with someone if you are listening through a podcast app. That means the world to me. You can find all of the links and everything I mentioned here, including a transcript, at learnandworksmarter.com/podcast/84. And remember, never stop learning.